So, what if the Black Death just never happened? It's one of the biggest what ifs in history. But before we can even begin to explore that alternate path, we have to do the groundwork. We need to build a really clear picture of the world as it was, right on the brink of that catastrophe. This is that deep dive, the essential first step. Think of this whole thing like we're running a massive historical simulation. And what's the first thing you do with any complex simulation? You have to calibrate it. You have to understand the initial conditions of the system. Every gear, every lever, every single point of stress that defined the world of the early 14th century. Exactly. So, in this explainer, we're not changing anything yet. We are freezing time right around the year 1346 and taking a detailed snapshot. We're not just looking at a timeline of kings and battles. We're trying to map out a complex, interconnected system that was poised for a massive shock. And here's how we're going to do it. First, we'll look at population pressure, how Europe was basically full. Then, we'll cover the massive famine that weakened everybody. After that, we'll dive into the structure of power, feudalism, and the huge unifying role of the church. We'll also see how connected this world actually was, and then we'll pull it all together to see the incredibly fragile balance of it all. Okay, let's jump right in. The most fundamental pressure point was simply people. After about 3 centuries of steady growth, Europe was just packed. It had pretty much pushed up against its absolute limits and was running out of room. I think this phrase is the perfect way to describe it: a tightly wound biological machine. It really gives you a sense of a dense, complex system where every single part is connected. And that means a failure in one little area, like a single bad harvest, could send these shockwaves of strain through the entire society. And the scale of this growth was just staggering. For a few hundred years, things were pretty good. A warmer climate, some better farming techniques, and the population just boomed. It may have even doubled, but this incredible expansion was being built on a foundation that just couldn't grow forever. And you can see the consequences right here. To feed all those extra people, they pushed the environment as hard as they could. They chopped down forests for farmland, drained marshes, and even started trying to grow crops on really poor, marginal soil. But you reach a point of diminishing returns. They were working harder and harder for less and less food. The system had no slack left. It had slammed right into an ecological ceiling. Now, a system with no slack is a brittle one. And in the early 14th century, that brittleness got put to the test. The first massive shock to this fragile machine wasn't a plague. It was a famine. An absolutely devastating one. Starting in 1315, the weather just completely turned. The rain started, and it basically didn't stop for years. This wasn't just one bad harvest. It was a rolling catastrophe. First, the crops failed, and people started to starve. Then, to make things even worse, diseases swept through the livestock, destroying what little food supply was left. Millions died. And here's the crucial takeaway. The Great Famine cast a really long shadow. The generation of people who were alive in the 1340s had grown up in a world of hunger and scarcity. This means that, as a population, they were biologically more vulnerable. Their immune systems were compromised long before the next disaster hit. Okay, so we've got the biological pressure. Now let's look at the social structure. How was this overpopulated, weakened continent actually organized? Well, for the vast majority of people, the answer was feudalism. And the reality for most people under feudalism was serfdom. This means you weren't a free agent. You were legally tied to the land you worked. You couldn't just decide to pack up and move for a better opportunity. You were, for all intents and purposes, part of the estate itself. You can kind of think of it as a contract, but a very unequal one. The lord provided the land and some basic protection. In return, the serf provided the labor to work that land plus rent, often paid in crops. The system did provide stability and a way to produce food, but the cost for the average person was immense. Almost no personal freedom and zero economic power. This brings us to a really simple economic truth about the pre-plague world. Labor was abundant. There were just way more people than there were jobs. And basic supply and demand tells you what that means. Wages were incredibly low, and the average worker had no leverage. If you complained, your lord could find 10 other people desperate for your spot. Workers were easily replaceable. So with all this pressure, all this inequality, you have to ask, what was the glue holding this whole thing together? The answer is a single, unimaginably powerful institution that provided the operating system for everyone's reality: the Catholic Church. It's almost impossible for us to grasp how central the church was to literally everything. It wasn't just a place you went on Sunday. The church was the largest landowner in Europe. It had its own legal systems. It controlled virtually all education and knowledge. And it held immense political power. It could legitimize or delegitimize kings. It was woven into the absolute fabric of life. And maybe its most important function was that the church provided the answers. Why is there a famine? It is God's will. Why is that man the king? Because he is ordained by God. By providing the ultimate explanation for why things were the way they were, it reinforced the social order. It was a powerful, powerful source of stability, even when things were terrible. Now, we need to clear up a common myth. The idea that this was a totally isolated, dark age is just wrong. The reality is that 14th century Europe was a surprisingly connected place, all tied together by vast and ancient networks of trade. So yeah, forget the image of isolated little villages that know nothing of the outside world. The reality was way more dynamic. Goods, ideas, and people were constantly moving across huge distances. And the engines of this connection were the Italian city-states like Venice and Genoa. Their ships crisscrossed the Mediterranean, linking Europe to North Africa, the Byzantine Empire, the great Islamic caliphates, and from there, all the way to Central Asia and China via the Silk Road. They were bringing back luxury goods like silk and spices. It was a kind of proto-globalization. But this interconnectedness came with a massive, hidden vulnerability. The same routes that carried silk and spices were also perfect highways for something else. They carried organisms. A rat could hide on a grain ship. A flea could hide in a bolt of cloth. They traveled just as easily as the goods themselves. Okay, so let's put all of these pieces together. What is our final snapshot? What was the state of the European system right on the eve of the plague? Here it is. This is our system. It's overpopulated and ecologically on the brink. Its people are physically weakened, its social structure is rigid and unequal, it's all held together by the universal authority of the church, and it's all tied together by these long-distance trade routes. You could say it's stable, but it's the stability of a house of cards. The whole thing is standing, but it is incredibly vulnerable to a big shock. In our history, the Black Death was that shock. It was a horrific event that acted like a release valve for all this pressure, shattering the old system. But in the alternate world we're about to explore, that shock never comes. The plague never happens. The pressure just keeps building and building and building. So the real question, the one we'll tackle next time, is what breaks instead?
History doesn't always turn on a single battle or a king's decree. Sometimes, the entire future of a continent can hinge on something as fragile as a single voyage, and we've arrived at that exact moment. Our story begins right here, Kaffa, a Genoese trading port on the Crimean Peninsula. Think of it as a bustling intersection of commerce between East and West. In our history, of course, this is ground zero, the precise entry point for the Black Death into Europe.
So what actually happened in our timeline was just brutally, grimly effective. The besieging Mongol army, already being ravaged by a disease they couldn't possibly understand, turned it into a weapon. They began launching infected bodies over the city walls. As the plague took root inside, the Genoese merchants did the only rational thing they could. They fled. 12 galleys loaded with goods and a deadly invisible passenger set sail aiming for the heart of Europe.
And right here, this is our point of divergence. It's not a change in a big decision, but a simple change in circumstance. The chain of infection that remade our world was long, and every link in that chain was fragile. So what would it take to break just one?
Nothing more than a sudden, violent squall. The kind of storm that the Black Sea is famous for. The kind that has swallowed ships for centuries. In this timeline, those 12 galleys fleeing Kaffa are caught in it. They're lost. And the pathogen they carry, Yersinia pestis, sinks with them to the bottom of the sea. Europe is never seeded. The plague never arrives.
So the first and most immediate consequence isn't about what happens, but about what doesn't happen. Europe never experiences the Great Dying. There is no catastrophic demographic reset. That population curve, which had already been pushing the continent's resources to the brink, well, it just keeps on climbing.
And this chart really just lays it out. The bar on the left, that's our timeline, a population that's been hollowed out, leaving the survivors in a world that's suddenly emptier and richer in resources. But the bar on the right, that's this new reality, not a world in recovery, but one facing a continued, relentless rise in human density on a finite amount of land.
So instead of rebuilding, Europe is compressing. More and more people are competing for the exact same amount of land, the same jobs, the same food. All those pressures that led to the Great Famine back in 1315, they don't go away. They just intensify. Now, this kind of population pressure has a direct and immediate impact on the economy. In our history, the Black Death was an economic earthquake. It made labor scarce, and therefore valuable. By removing that event, we essentially preserve the economic conditions that existed just before the plague. The comparison here is stark. In our timeline, the massive labor shortage forced wages to go up. It gave peasants a kind of bargaining power they'd never had before. In this new timeline, the exact opposite is true. With a surplus of workers all competing for jobs, wages stagnate or even fall. All the leverage stays right where it was, with the landowners.
And this question really gets to the heart of the technological consequences. You see, innovation is so often driven by necessity. Without a powerful economic reason to save on labor costs, there's just far less pressure to invent more efficient tools or develop new farming techniques. Progress doesn't grind to a halt, of course, but the catalyst for rapid change is gone.
And that economic reality has profound social consequences. The feudal system, which by the 1340s was already showing some signs of strain, doesn't get the massive shock that would have shattered it. Instead, it gets the one thing that can actually reinforce it: a huge, desperate, and competing workforce.
At its core, feudalism is a system for managing land and labor. Its entire power structure depends on a simple imbalance. The peasants' need for land has to be greater than the lord's need for their labor. The absence of the plague makes sure that imbalance stays firmly in the lord's favor. This creates a powerful feedback loop. The growing labor surplus means peasants have very little choice but to accept whatever terms are offered for a small plot of land. This in turn solidifies the lord's power, which then prevents the kind of social mobility that we saw begin to emerge after the plague. The social pyramid doesn't crack. It just gets heavier, stronger. So, the absence of this huge crisis doesn't necessarily create a better world. It creates a more static one. The system, because it never got that disruptive shock, loses its flexibility. Stability hardens into rigidity, which can actually make the whole structure much more brittle in the long run. Let's move forward to the year 1400. This alternate Europe is, on the surface, stable, but underneath, it's straining. The continent avoided a massive catastrophe, that's true, but it also missed out on a total transformation. It's a world without the scars of the plague, but it's also a world without the renewal that often follows a fire. This table really sums up the key differences. The Europe of our timeline in 1400 is a world in flux. Its population is recovering, its labor is valuable, its old social structures are being questioned. But this alternate Europe is rigid. It has a much larger but more pressured population, cheap labor, a reinforced social hierarchy, and institutions like the church, whose authority was never really shaken.
So what does this world lack? It lacks the sudden, shocking emptiness of ours. The fields are full, the villages are crowded. There is no demographic reset.
It lacks that violent reordering of the economy. The value of a single person's work in purely economic terms remains low. There is no economic shock.
And it lacks the cracking of that feudal pyramid. The old bonds of obligation, of serf to lord, they hold firm, maybe firmer than they ever have. There is no social rupture.
So what's left? All that's left is the slow, relentless, building pressure of a system that is quietly pushed past its ecological and social limits, with no release valve anywhere in sight.
And this leaves us with a final, critical question. A system that avoids a sudden, violent shock might be spared a lot of suffering, but it also misses the chance to adapt, to evolve. In avoiding the crisis of the 14th century, has this Europe simply set itself up for a much larger, more systemic collapse down the road?
All right, welcome back. So in our simulation, we've taken the Black Death right out of the history books. And now we're diving into the fallout, the really deep second-order effects over 2 centuries where the pressure just keeps building. So, picture this. It's the year 1400. Our simulated Europe is a continent that is just stretched to its absolute limit. Because the plague never happened, the population has just kept growing and growing and growing, straining a medieval system that was never ever built to handle this many people. It's a world that's basically suffocating under its own weight. But here's the kicker. What if all the release valves are blocked? That's what we're going to explore in this part of the simulation. Looking at that critical period from 1400 to 1600, we're going to see how all this massive pent-up pressure tries to find a way out and how it tests the very foundations of the era, the state, the church, and even the idea of the known world itself. Okay, so here's our game plan. We'll start with this idea of the pressure cooker continent. Then we'll look at how power, faith, and expansion all play out differently. And finally, we'll see where all this leaves Europe by 1600, right on the edge of, well, something big. Right, let's get into it. To really get our heads around just how different this alternate history is, we've got to put the 15th century from our timeline side by side with the one from the simulation. And believe me, the differences they're stark. They're foundational. See, in our world, the time after the plague, it actually created some unexpected opportunities. With so many people gone, labor was suddenly scarce, and that meant it was valuable. Wages went up, the old feudal bonds started to weaken. But in our simulation, it's the complete opposite. You have this massive surplus of labor, which keeps wages rock bottom and actually reinforces that rigid feudal hierarchy. So it's not a century of recovery, it's a century of just compression, stagnation. Okay, so with that pressure building, let's see what happens with our first potential release valve. The power of the state. In our history, this is when we started to see these strong centralized kingdoms really take shape. But here, yeah, it's a very different story. And this really gets to the core political problem in the simulation. How do you build a modern state when the old powers that be were never weakened in the first place? Think about it. In our timeline, the Black Death absolutely devastated the landed aristocracy. Their numbers were down, their power was shaken, and that created this vacuum that kings could step into to consolidate power. Here, that big clear-out just never happened. And this table really lays out just how weak the monarchy is in our simulation. The aristocracy, they're still numerous, they're powerful, and they're fighting tooth and nail against any attempt by a king to centralize power. Taxation is still all tied up in the land they control, not some new, growing ermine economy. And the peasants, well, they have no leverage. They're restless, sure, but they're a problem for the local lords, not a source of power for a king to tap into. So, what's the takeaway here? The crucial point is that political power completely fails as an escape route. Instead of strong central states directing all that energy, power stays fragmented, local. The crown is brittle, it can't impose order, it can't get the resources it needs to deal with this massive population crisis. So the first valve is completely blocked. All right, so if political change is off the table, what about the second great institution of the era? Faith. The church was the ideological glue holding medieval Europe together. And in our timeline, it was shaken to its core by the plague. But here, it remains as strong as ever. Yeah, this is a really important point we touched on last time. Without seeing priests die in droves, without prayers going unanswered against the pestilence, the church doesn't have that deep existential crisis of faith. It sails right into the 15th century with its authority and legitimacy pretty much completely intact. You know, the Protestant Reformation that we know from history was, at its heart, a theological revolution. It came from this deep spiritual anxiety that really had its roots in the trauma of the Black Death. People were questioning everything: God's plan, salvation, the church's role in it all. But in this alternate world, the challenge to the church comes from a totally different place. It's not about faith. It's about hunger. It's about land. In a world with way too many people and not nearly enough land, who's the single biggest landowner? The church. Suddenly, all that wealth becomes a huge target for resentful nobles and desperate kings who need cash. And this is where things get really interesting. There is a conflict with the church, for sure, but it's all about money and power. Kings try to seize land, nobles argue about taxes. The church might be forced to give some ground financially. It bends. But its spiritual authority, it doesn't break. There's no big ideological split, no systemic release of that pressure. So the second valve is also blocked solid. Okay, so with the internal options, political and religious, completely jammed, all that pressure has to find somewhere else to go. And now we turn to the third and final valve, looking outward, expanding across the oceans. The age of discovery in our history was really fueled by a new kind of engine: capital. It was all about merchants looking for profits, new trade routes, new resources for this budding market economy. But in our simulation, Europe hasn't built up that kind of capital. The motivation is much more primal. It's not about profit. It's about raw population pressure. It's a desperate search for land. So you see the difference? Instead of being pulled by the promise of riches, this Europe is being pushed by the very real threat of imploding. The main goal is just to get rid of surplus people. It's a way for all those second and third sons of the nobility, who have zero land to inherit, to go out and carve out new feudal estates for themselves. And for a powerful, unshaken church, well, it's a massive missionary opportunity. And the consequence of that is just profound. This is not the beginning of global trading empires, no. This is the violent projection of a rigid, failing feudal system onto new continents. The goal isn't to create new markets. It's to grab territory and just transplant the old hierarchies. This kind of expansion is all about pure extraction and control, not economic integration. So, we arrive at the year 1600, and our simulation hits its most critical point yet. We've looked at the three main pressure valves: state building, religious reform, and overseas expansion. And what have we found? None of them have actually worked. None of them have released that core tension in the system. Just think about that. For 200 years, the fundamental problem of too many people has just been getting worse and worse. They've managed it, they've redirected it, they've even tried to export it, but they've never, ever solved it. That pressure has been building quietly, relentlessly, for about 6 generations. And by 1600, you can see the cracks appearing absolutely everywhere. The cities are a mess, with chronic food shortages and sanitation crises. Peasant revolts are getting bigger, more frequent, more organized. The aristocracy is practically at war with itself over the scraps of land that are left. There's this simmering economic resentment against the church. And those new colonies? They aren't sources of wealth, they're unstable, resource-draining headaches. Remember that insight from the simulation log? Systems that avoid sudden shocks often accumulate deeper ones. Well, now we're seeing that play out in real time. By dodging the sharp, painful reset of the Black Death, this version of Europe has allowed a much deeper, much more structural crisis to build up. The problems aren't just on the surface anymore, they're baked into the very foundations of society. And this is the real fork in the road. This continent is not heading towards the future that we recognize. The things that led to our scientific revolution, to our wars of religion, those ingredients just aren't here. This Europe is on a totally different track, heading for a completely different kind of crisis. So we're ending this part of the simulation on an absolute knife's edge. The stability of the last 200 years, it was just an illusion. The pressure has now reached a point where it simply can't be contained anymore. A system this compressed doesn't just bend, it breaks. The question is no longer if it will break, but how. So by 1700, this alternate Europe of ours has held on for centuries without the demographic reset of the plague, and it hasn't collapsed. Instead, it's become what we could call a structurally compressed continent, a society where just immense population density has made land scarce, labor incredibly cheap, and social hierarchies rigid as stone. All those pressures we've been tracking for centuries, well, they're at a boiling point, and this sets the stage for a massive turning point. Okay, so into this incredibly pressurized system, we're about to introduce a brand new, powerful variable: mechanization. We're talking about the steam engine, the factory, the whole idea of mass industrial production. And these new forces are arriving in a world that is just fundamentally different, way more crowded, and a lot more tense than the one they showed up in our own history. And that right there is the central question for this entire era. When you have this massive, cheap labor force, does that stifle the need for machines? Does it delay the Industrial Revolution? Or does that exact same pressure build up to a crisis point, forcing technology to be adopted as the only possible way out? We're calling this critical moment the industrial fork. Think of it as a point where the timeline literally splits into two completely distinct but equally logical futures. A single starting condition, that intense population pressure, can actually produce two profoundly different outcomes for the industrial age. So let's dive in and explore the first of these two possible futures. So here we have path A. This is the timeline where the sheer abundance of people actually slows down the rise of the machine. And the economic logic behind this, it's really powerful, but it's also deceptively simple. See, in our own history, industrialization in Britain was pushed forward, at least in part, by pretty high labor costs. That made investing in expensive new technology a worthwhile gamble. But in this timeline, centuries of surplus population have pushed wages way, way down. And when you have tons of people willing to work for next to nothing, The incentive to shell out a fortune on some big new machine, well, it just isn't there. Britain's the perfect place to see this in action. It's still got the coal, the inventors, all the global trade networks. But here, that core economic reason to change has been flipped on its head. With wages at rock bottom, the profit margins for those early, clunky factories would be so thin you could barely see them. Or maybe they just lose money. So mechanization does happen, but it's more of a slow burn, kind of spreading gradually across the continent instead of just exploding into a full-blown revolution. So fast forward to 1900 in Path A, and what do we see? We still see a modern colonial Europe, but it's different. It's more conservative. Industry doesn't completely dominate the economy. The old land-owning aristocrats hold on to a lot of their power, and social change is this slow evolution, not a violent upheaval. That's one possible future. But what if all that pressure didn't lead to a slowdown? What if it led to an explosion? And that brings us to Path D. Here, the economic logic does a complete 180. In this world, that extreme population pressure doesn't slow things down. It actually becomes the fuel for the fire. You see, there's a tipping point. It's the point where population density gets so extreme that farmland is chopped up into tiny, useless plots, and the cities are just choking on millions of unemployed, desperate people. Suddenly, cheap labor isn't an asset anymore. It's a tinderbox waiting for a spark. The constant threat of starvation and revolt is just hanging over everyone's heads. This kind of crisis forces the hand of governments and the elites. Industrialization stops being about profit margins and becomes a desperate tool for social control and national survival. You have to build factories, not just to make stuff, but to soak up all these extra people, to feed the cities, and to stop the whole system from ripping itself apart. And once this crisis-fueled industrialization kicks off, it just takes off with breathtaking speed. Because it's so urgent, you could see railroads, factories, and entire cities spring up even faster and more chaotically than in our own timeline. The machine is basically the only release valve for a system that is at its absolute breaking point, and that triggers a much sharper, more violent plunge into the industrial age. All right, so by the time we hit 1900, this industrial fork has literally split Europe in two, creating two profoundly different versions of the modern world. And the social fallout, it's like night and day. Path A gives you a slow, gradual transformation, where the old elites keep their grip and class conflict is a bit more muted. But Path B, that creates a rapid, chaotic explosion of cities that just fuels intense class polarization and gives birth to radical political movements way earlier and with way more power than we saw in our history. You can really see how different they are when you put them side by side. Look, both paths end up with industrial, colonial powers that are going to shape the entire globe. But what's running them, their internal engine, is totally different. Path A is evolutionary, it's structurally conservative. Path B is abrupt, it's volatile, and it is structurally explosive. So we're ending the 19th century with two very different versions of Europe on the world stage. One looks stable, maybe a little conservative, having managed its modernization carefully. The other is a straight-up powder keg, forged in crisis and defined by conflict from the very beginning. Both of them are about to face the relentless pressures of a new century, and it's a century that's going to test their foundations in ways they can't even begin to imagine. Next time, we're going to see what happens when these two Europes, the evolutionary one and the explosive one, smash head first into the brutal realities of the 20th century.
Okay, so here we are. The year is 1900. After 5 centuries of uninterrupted population growth, our simulation hasn't produced just one alternative Europe, but two. In one timeline, that relentless demographic pressure acted like a slow, grinding glacier, reshaping the continent gradually. In the other, it was a powder keg, an explosive catalyst. And now, the 20th century has arrived, ready to test both of these worlds, quite literally, to their breaking point.
So, here's how we're going to break it down. We'll start with the two thresholds that define Europe at the start of the century. Then we'll model outcome A, the conservative path. After that, we'll tackle outcome B, the volatile one. And finally, we'll pull back to see the very different shadows these two potential futures cast over our modern world.
Right, it's 1900. For half a millennium, the pressure has been building, all without the release valve of the plague. This has pushed the continent down two completely different industrial roads, and the two systems that resulted from this are now standing right on the brink of the modern age.
And this is the fundamental split. Path A gives us a Europe that modernized slowly, almost cautiously. It kept a lot of its old hierarchical DNA. Power is still partly in the hands of the aristocracy. But Path B, well, that's a Europe where industrialization was a flash fire.
It happened so fast and so intensely that it just tore society in half, creating deep, deep fractures and setting the stage for some serious conflict.
So let's dive into our first model, this slower, more conservative Europe. How does a system like this, one that prefers gradual change, handle the absolute meat grinder of the 20th century, an era that was defined by total war and extreme ideologies?
Now, in this scenario, conflict doesn't just disappear, not by a long shot, but the nature of the conflict changes. See, without that explosive industrial buildup we saw in our timeline, the ability to wage a prolonged, super-destructive total war is just lower. You still get arms races for sure, but the sheer scale of military production is more limited. This could mean major wars are shorter and, thankfully, less devastating.
And that gradual pace has a huge political ripple effect. When you don't have a massive, brand new urban working class packed into cities overnight, those really radical revolutionary ideas have a much harder time catching on. So change happens through reform, expanding voting rights, creating constitutions, not by violent system-wide collapse. The old guard gives up power bit by bit, but they aren't just swept away in a revolution.
But there's always a trade-off, isn't there? The price for a more stable Europe is a less dominant one. That huge industrial gap between Europe and other rising powers, like the United States, is much smaller here. This means the global balance of power starts to shift earlier, and maybe, just maybe, more peacefully, because it's not happening in the shadow of two world-shattering wars.
So by the time we get to 2026, what we see is a Europe that's prosperous, it's stable, but it's one major player in a multipolar world. It's not the undisputed center of the globe. It managed to avoid the worst of the 20th century's horrors, but in doing so, it gave up its claim to being the world's sole superpower.
All right, let's switch gears and look at our other path, the hyper-industrialized, socially fractured Europe. What happens when you take a system that was forged in extreme pressure and rapid, violent change, and then you throw it into the inferno of the 20th century?
Well, in this world, the capacity for war is terrifying. It's potentially even greater than in our own history. All that industrialization that was crammed into the 19th century created an economic engine that is just perfectly designed for churning out weapons on a massive scale. Total war isn't just a possibility, it becomes sustainable for horrifyingly long periods of time.
And this massive industrial power is fueled by extreme ideologies. The deep class divides and social chaos are the perfect breeding ground for radical movements on both the far left and the far right. This Europe is just trapped in these cycles of revolution and counter-revolution, which leads to more frequent and more stable authoritarian governments as the state tries desperately to keep the lid on.
And here's the great dark paradox of this timeline. All this relentless chaos and conflict turns out to be an incredible engine for innovation. The intense competition between nations, both in war and in trade, pushes technology forward at a breakneck pace. This Europe is unbelievably advanced, but its power is built on a foundation of sand, constantly being eroded by its own political instability.
By 2026, this path leaves Europe as a technological powerhouse, but it's been weakened by its own endless internal struggles. Its constant wars created power vacuums that other nations, like the US and rising powers in Asia, were more than happy to fill. It's still a major force, no doubt, but it's no longer the structural center of the world.
So let's bring both of these models onto the stage at the same time for a final look. Here, you can really see the two long, completely different shadows that were cast across time, all because a plague ship did or didn't arrive in 1347.
Here they are, side by side. Outcome A is the evolutionary story, slower, more stable, but with a less dramatic impact on the world stage. Outcome B is the volatile story, incredibly fast, innovative, and powerful, but ultimately it keeps tearing itself apart.
And this is the absolute heart of our entire simulation. This is the key insight. That crushing pressure of overpopulation had to go somewhere. By dodging a biological catastrophe, Europe simply shifted that pressure. It moved it from biology into the very structure of its society, its politics, and its economy, where it would stay for the next 500 years.
So now we're holding two fully formed futures in our hands, two complete versions of the modern world, one that bent under the centuries of pressure and one that repeatedly fractured under it. And what's wild is that both seem like logical, almost inevitable outcomes of the very same starting point.
But that leaves us with the ultimate question. Which path creates the more resilient, the more influential, the more successful civilization in the long run? Is it the stable and evolutionary path, or the chaotic and innovative one? That is the final question, and in our final part, we will render the system's verdict.
All right, for the last 5 parts, we've been deep inside a story, watching a simulated world unfold without the Black Death. But now it's time to pull back. We're stepping out of the narrative. This isn't a story anymore. This is the final analysis, a structural evaluation of the entire system we've just explored. So how are we going to do that? We'll break it down into 6 key areas. We're going to look at everything from the basic path of population growth all the way to the balance of global power. This is the framework that's going to let us really measure the impact of our one big change. And finally, reach a verdict. You know, the core idea of this whole series was actually pretty simple. We took out one single thing, the Yersinia pestis bacterium, and just watched what happened. We didn't add anything new, we just stopped a massive historical break from occurring. So our job now is to figure out what that one change really did to the machinery of history itself. And we have to start with the most basic thing of all. People. Population. Demographics are kind of the engine of history before the Industrial Age, and by taking away the plague, we totally changed the fuel supply for that engine. This right here is the central difference. In our timeline, the plague was like a massive, sudden release of pressure. All of a sudden, labor was rare, which made it valuable. That gave power to ordinary people and helped crack the whole feudal system. But in our simulation, that pressure never gets released. It just builds and builds for centuries, making the old power structures stronger and keeping the value of a person's work way, way down. So you see, the demographic shock didn't just disappear. It was basically inverted and spread out over hundreds of years. Instead of one huge collapse, this alternate world got a slow, grinding, cumulative compression. It wasn't a single event, it was a constant force shaping everything for centuries. And of course, that kind of pressure on the population has a huge knock-on effect. Which brings us to our next category, power. Who has it, who keeps it, and how the old elites hang on. In our history, the plague really sped up political change. As the old feudal lords lost their grip, new centralized states and city-based capitalists moved in to fill the void. But in the world without the plague, those old aristocratic families are way tougher to dislodge. Why? Because they have an endless supply of cheap labor, which is the source of their power. Modernization still happens, don't get me wrong, but it's a much slower, more gradual fight against a very entrenched old guard. And this is a really important theme you'll see again and again in this analysis. The final destination, a world of modern, centralized states that seems like it was going to happen anyway. The forces driving it were already there. But the timing and the path to get there, completely different. Taking away the plague didn't change the endpoint, but it absolutely changed the journey. Which brings us to maybe the most critical question in the entire simulation. What happens to industrialization? How does a world with a constant surplus of people react when the machine age finally arrives? Think about it. In our timeline, labor was expensive, especially in places like Britain. So there was a huge incentive to invent a machine that could do the work of 10 people. It just made economic sense. In our counterfactual world, that incentive is much, much weaker, and that led to our 2 possible futures. Path A is a slow, gradual industrialization, held back by cheap labor. But Path B is fascinating. It's the idea that eventually the population pressure gets so extreme that you have to mechanize, not to save money, but just to find something for all the extra people to do and stop society from collapsing. So in either case, you still get industrialization, but the rhythm is totally off. So let's be super clear. Removing the plague did not stop the Industrial Revolution. All the ingredients were still there: the coal, the science, the trade networks. But what it did was warp the timing in the feel of it. It either delayed it or it compressed it into a much more sudden and volatile event. Okay, so if Europe's internal clock is all messed up, what does that mean for its relationship with the rest of the world? Was Europe's global dominance just an accident of the plague? Well, the simulation suggests that European expansion was probably going to happen no matter what. In fact, you could argue that all that population pressure at home would have made the push to colonize even stronger. But the kind of dominance changes. In Path A, with its slower industrialization, the rest of the world catches up faster, and you get a multipolar world much sooner. In Path B, Europe's dominance is huge but also really unstable. But here's the wild part. In both scenarios, by the time we get to 2026, the world looks pretty familiar. Europe is still influential, but it's just one of several major powers. It's a fascinating result. The 19th and 20th centuries would have been completely different, but the long-term destination, geopolitically speaking, seems to converge. By today, the global power structure pretty much ends up in the same place. Now let's shift from empires and machines to what's going on inside people's heads. What happens to ideas, to faith, to secularism, in a world that never got that massive psychological shock of the Black Death? I mean, the plague was a profound crisis of faith. It made people question everything, and it really accelerated challenges to the church's power. Without that sudden break, our simulation shows a much slower, more careful evolution of ideas. Big changes like secularization and reform still happen. They're being pushed by things like the printing press and new science, but they're missing that traumatic catalyst that put them into overdrive in our world. The Enlightenment still comes, but it probably feels and arrives very differently. And again, we see the same pattern. The deep currents pushing toward modernity or systemic. They were too big to be stopped. The plague acted like an accelerant. Taking it away just meant the process took longer. It didn't cancel it. So, we've looked at the system from just about every angle: demographics, power, industry, global reach, and ideas. We've laid out all the evidence from our simulation. Now it's time to answer the question that started this whole series. We really have three possible verdicts here. Was the change minimal, meaning history just would have found a way to be pretty much the same? Was it chaotic, sending the world down a totally unstable and unrecognizable path? Or was it transformational, something that fundamentally changed the journey of history, even if the destination was similar? Well, we can rule out chaotic right away. In none of our scenarios did European civilization just collapse or fail to modernize. The system was more resilient than that. But minimal? Absolutely not. You can't call centuries of different wage structures, social mobility, and industrial rhythms a minimal change. The impact was far too deep and lasted for far too long. That really only leaves one logical conclusion. Removing the Black Death had a transformational effect on history. And that's exactly what transformational means here. The destination, a modern industrial world, stayed the same, but the path to get there was fundamentally altered. The Black Death was like a violent historical shortcut. Removing it meant history had to take the long way around, a path defined by centuries of slow, grinding pressure, instead of one sudden, explosive rupture. And this brings us to what might be the single biggest insight of this whole exercise. We tend to think of pandemics as these random events that create new history out of nowhere. But what the simulation really shows is that they're more like earthquakes. They don't create the pressure between the tectonic plates. They're just the moment all that existing pressure gets violently released and redistributed. In the end, history is a pressure system. In our timeline, that pressure found its release valve in a bacterium. In the world we simulated, it had to channel itself through centuries of social and economic strain instead. The form changed, but the forward momentum of the system itself, that didn't. Pressure always eventually finds a way forward.